It all started with the blueberries. Sunday morning, Claire sat at the dining table, absently scrolling through her phone while nibbling on a blueberry muffin. She's never liked blueberries. She once told me the texture gave her the creeps. I'd laughed about it for years, using it as a quirky little story to share with friends. Yet here she was, eating them like they'd always been her favorite. "You're eating blueberries now?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She barely looked up. "Yeah, I guess I've grown into them. People's tastes change, right?" That should have been the end of it, but it gnawed at me. Not because of the blueberries themselves, but because of how dismissive she'd been. Like I shouldn't have even noticed. And it wasn't just that. Earlier that week, I found a strange key fob in her coat pocket. It wasn't for her car, our house, or anything else I recognized. I held it up as she came out of the shower. "Lose something?" Claire froze for half a second before wrapping herself in a towel and smiling. "Oh, that's just from work. We had some guest speakers at the firm, and they gave out little trinkets. It's useless. I should have tossed it." Her explanation seemed plausible, but why hadn't she mentioned it before? Claire was the kind of person who posted everything on social media, from work events to the cute donuts someone brought to the office. And then there was the humming. She'd always had a lovely singing voice but rarely used it. Yet over the past few weeks, she'd started humming little tunes, melodies I didn't recognize. I finally asked, "What's that song? It's stuck in my head now." She looked startled, then shrugged. "Oh, just something I heard on the radio." But we didn't listen to the same radio stations. Sunday evening, as she got ready for her so-called brunch, she sprayed herself with a new body mist, floral and sweet, a departure from her usual subtle fragrances. When I asked about it, she waved it off. "A coworker gave it to me, said it suits my vibe." Her vibe, the key fob, the blueberries, the humming, none of it screamed guilt on its own, but together they felt like puzzle pieces that didn't belong to the picture I thought I knew. As she walked out the door with a quick kiss goodbye, I found myself standing in the living room, holding that fob in my hand and staring at the untouched bouquet of roses I'd bought for her last week. Something didn't fit, and I was going to find out why. The first clue came sooner than I expected. Monday evening, as Claire worked late in her home office, I sat at the kitchen table pretending to focus on my laptop. Instead, my eyes wandered to her purse, sitting slightly open on the counter. It was a sleek leather bag I had bought for her just last month, a gift I'd chosen carefully. Of course, Claire didn't know it wasn't just any purse. After that first wave of suspicion, the blueberries, the humming, the strange key fob, I decided I needed answers. So, I had sewn a small tracking chip into the lining of the bag before giving it to her. It was subtle, undetectable, but precise enough to sync with an app on my phone. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, a way to ease the doubts creeping in. But now, as I glanced at the app, the little blinking dot marking her purse's location earlier that day had told a very different story. Her movements didn't match the story she'd given me. At lunchtime, she hadn't gone to her office cafeteria like she'd said. The chip showed her car parked outside a downtown cafe, a place I'd never heard her mention. And later, instead of heading straight home, she'd stopped for 20 minutes at an upscale gym we didn't belong to. The app didn't tell me why, but it told me enough to keep the knot in my stomach growing. When Claire emerged from her office that evening, she flashed me her usual smile. "You look tired," she said, brushing her hand over my shoulder. "Don't stay up too late." I nodded, forcing a grin in return. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The purse had been a calculated risk, one I hated myself for taking. But with every odd detail piling up, I couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. Claire was hiding something. The next morning, I decided to follow the tracking app's data more closely. Tuesday and Wednesday were more of the same. Lunches at unfamiliar spots, long stops at the gym, and a mid-afternoon trip to the parking lot of a downtown hotel. The hotel. The same name that had popped up on the key fob I'd found in her coat pocket. By Thursday, my patience had worn thin. As Claire left the house that evening, claiming she was meeting Jenny for yoga and a quick drink, I forced myself to act normal. "Enjoy yourself," I said with a warm smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys and opened the app. The blinking dot stopped at the same downtown hotel I'd seen earlier in the week. I parked a block away, heart pounding as I stared at the glowing sign above the building's entrance. 30 minutes later, I saw her step out of her car and walk into the lobby. She wasn't wearing her usual yoga leggings or even casual attire. Instead, she was dressed in a sleek, black dress and heels. I waited in my car. Then, through the hotel's glass doors, I saw her meet him. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp black shirt. His confidence unmistakable. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, a smile I hadn't seen in months. The man wasn't just anyone. He was the waiter from our favorite restaurant, the one who always served us with a wide grin, the one she used to joke with while I signed the check. And suddenly, everything clicked. I sat there in the darkened car, staring at the hotel entrance long after they'd disappeared inside. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of Claire. My Claire, laughing and smiling with another man in that intimate, familiar way. The waiter, of all people. He wasn't just a stranger. He was someone we both knew. He'd brought us meals, joked about the wine pairings, even complimented our choice of anniversary desserts. And now he was the shadow in my wife's double life. For the first time in days, the knot of doubt in my stomach gave way to something hotter, sharper. Anger. But I didn't go inside. Not yet. Barging in without a plan would only give them a chance to lie their way out. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof that Claire couldn't dismiss as paranoia or misunderstanding. I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The house was eerily quiet without her there. When Claire walked through the door later that night, I was waiting. She entered with her usual cheery facade, the faint sound of her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Yoga was great," she said, dropping her purse on the couch. "Jenny and I grabbed a drink after, just like I said." I stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "Sounds fun," I replied evenly. She looked up at me, tilting her head. "What's with the tone?" "Oh, nothing," I said, forcing a tight smile. "Just wondering if you had any other plans tonight. Anything interesting?" Her brows furrowed, and for a split second, there was something in her eyes. Panic. But then she recovered, laughing lightly. "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm. "I mean, you didn't happen to stop by a hotel, did you? Maybe meet an old friend?" Claire's smile faltered, and she turned to grab her purse, fiddling with the strap. "What are you even saying? Are you accusing me of something?" I didn't answer right away, letting the silence hang heavy between us. Then, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the tracking app, holding it up for her to see. The blinking dot was unmistakable. "This is your purse," I said, my voice steady but cold. "And this is where it's been tonight. Care to explain?" Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Don't lie to me, Claire," I warned, stepping even closer. "I saw you. I saw him." She blinked rapidly, her fingers trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw you meet the waiter from Seaside Grill, the one you always laugh with when we're there. I watched you walk into that hotel together." My voice cracked despite my efforts to keep calm. Claire's lips parted, her expression shifting from fear to indignation. "You're spying on me? Is this who you are now, Greg? Some paranoid lunatic tracking my every move? Don't twist this around." I snapped, the anger finally boiling over. "You've been lying to me for months. I can feel it, and now I know it." She stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "You're crazy. This is insane. I was meeting a client at the hotel for work. The waiter? I don't even know his name. He must have been there by coincidence." "Don't insult my intelligence, Claire," I said through gritted teeth. "I've been patient, but I'm done playing dumb. Tell me the truth." For a moment it seemed like she might. Her shoulders sagged, her lips trembling as though the weight of it all had finally caught up to her. But then, in true Claire fashion, She squared her shoulders and met my gaze head-on. "There's nothing to tell," she said, her voice icy. "You're imagining things. And if you can't trust me, maybe we have bigger problems than my work meetings." I felt a wave of frustration so strong it nearly knocked the wind out of me. She was doubling down, twisting the knife in ways I hadn't anticipated. I stepped back, letting her words sink in. "You're right, Claire," I said, my voice soft but firm. "We do have a problem, and I promise you, I'll solve it." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she held her ground. That night, as she slept, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her denial only strengthened my resolve. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I would uncover it myself. The next few days were a haze of tension and silent battles. Claire pretended everything was fine, like we hadn't stood in our living room days earlier, tearing at the frayed edges of our marriage. She made breakfast, asked about my day, and even curled up next to me on the couch at night, feigning normalcy. But I wasn't playing along. I had decided to dig deeper, and this time I wasn't relying on just the tracker. I wanted undeniable proof, something so damning that even Claire's silver tongue couldn't talk her way out of it. That's when I called in backup. Dan, one of my oldest friends and an IT specialist, owed me a favor. I told him I suspected Claire was hiding something on her phone. Messages, photos, maybe even a second number. "I just need to know," I said, my voice raw. Dan was hesitant at first. "Greg, you're asking me to cross a line here. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," I replied. "She's lying to me, Dan. I can feel it in my gut. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and rebuild whatever's left of this. But if I'm right..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Done, Sigrid." "All right, bring me her phone. I'll clone it and get you everything. Just don't ask me to like what I find." That evening, I waited for Claire to fall asleep. When I heard her soft, steady breathing, I slipped her phone from her purse and drove to Dan's apartment. "Make it quick," I said, setting the phone on his desk. He nodded, already pulling out his tools. "Give me 10 minutes. As I paced the room, every scenario raced through my mind. What if it was innocent? What if I was wrong? But deep down, I knew better. Dan handed me the phone and a flash drive, his expression grim. "You're not going to like it," he warned. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and plugged the flash drive into my laptop. What I found unraveled me. The messages were there, dozens of them, all with the waiter, Tyrone. They were intimate, filled with inside jokes and plans to meet at hotels, cafes, and even our favorite restaurant. The language was raw and personal, painting a picture of a relationship that wasn't just physical but deeply emotional. Then there were the photos. Claire, smiling in ways she hadn't smiled for me in months, her hand resting casually on his shoulder. A selfie of them in what looked like a hotel room, his arm wrapped around her waist. And one video less than 10 seconds long of them laughing in bed. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving. For a moment, I just sat there, staring out at the darkened street. My world had shifted under me, and there was no turning back now. When I walked back into the house, Claire was still asleep, her face serene against the pillow. It struck me how deceptive that peace was, how it masked the chaos she had sown. I wanted to wake her, to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. Not fear exactly, something colder, more calculated. Instead, I returned to the laptop and opened a new folder, saving every text, every photo, and every video. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore. This was about preparing for the fallout. By the time Claire woke up the next morning, I was already downstairs, sipping coffee and scrolling through the hotel's website. "Morning," she said, yawning as she padded into the kitchen. "Morning," I replied, not looking up. "What's on your agenda today?" she asked, pouring herself a cup. I finally met her gaze, my face neutral. "Oh, just tying up some loose ends." Claire hesitated, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I caught it. She knew something was different, even if she didn't know what. As she left for work, I watched her go, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. The same scent she probably wore for him. I wasn't just waiting for answers anymore. I was waiting for the right moment to deliver the truth. By Friday evening, I had all the evidence I needed. Every text, photo, and video was neatly organized into folders on my laptop. I'd even printed a few of the most damning screenshots, not because I needed them right away, but because holding them in my hands made everything feel more real. Claire came home late again that night, claiming a last-minute meeting had run long. I didn't bother asking for details. I just nodded, watching her as she moved through the house with that same rehearsed ease. We had dinner in near silence, the clinking of cutlery filling the void. She tried to make small talk, asked about my work, mentioned a coworker's birthday coming up, but I couldn't summon the energy to respond with more than a grunt. "You've been so quiet lately," she said finally, setting her fork down and looking at me with those wide, innocent eyes. "Is something bothering you?" For a second, I almost admired her nerve. To ask me that question when she knew exactly what was wrong. I took a sip of water, placing the glass down with deliberate care. "Funny you should ask," I said, my tone calm but sharp enough to slice through the air. Her brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up, pulling a small folder from the counter behind me and dropping it onto the table. The printed screenshots spilled out, a chaotic splash of damning truths. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice rising, though her hands trembled as she picked up one of the pages. "You tell me?" I said, crossing my arms. Her eyes darted across the text, the photos, the undeniable proof. She tried to mask her reaction, but the color drained from her face. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter where I got it, Claire. What matters is that it's all here. The texts, the photos, the hotel meetings. Him." I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then, as if on cue, the tears came. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice cracking. "I swear, Greg, it's not. Tyrone and it's just... Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me with more lies." She stood, her chair screeching against the floor as she paced the kitchen. "Okay, fine," she said, her tone shifting to defiance. "Yes, I made a mistake, but it didn't mean anything. It was just, I don't know, an escape." "An escape," I repeated, my voice rising. "From what? From me? From this life we built together?" "You don't understand," she yelled, spinning to face me. "You're always so cold, so distant. I felt invisible, Greg. Like I didn't matter anymore. And screwing the waiter made you feel better?" I shot back, the venom in my voice unmistakable. Her lips quivered, but she didn't deny it.
I stepped closer, towering over her.
"You think you can spin this into my fault? Do you think I don't see through you, Claire? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, humiliating me." Tears streamed down her face now, but they didn't move me. "Not anymore. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. It got out of hand." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. "Got out of hand? Claire, you've turned our marriage into a joke." A joke. For a moment, the room was silent except for her quiet sobs. Then I spoke, my voice low but firm. "This isn't something we're coming back from. I'm done, Claire. I want a divorce." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face etched with panic.
"Greg, no.
"Please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. Anything. Just don't throw it all away." "You already threw it away," I said, stepping back. "And don't think for a second that I'm letting you walk away from this unscathed." Her eyes widened, fear flickering behind them. "This is only the beginning," I said, my voice cold as steel. "Your lies, your affair. It's all coming out. Your family, your friends, your coworkers. They'll all know exactly who you are." "Greg, you can't." "Watch me," I said, turning on my heel and walking out of the room, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of her own making. The morning after the confrontation, Claire left for work early, her face pale and her demeanor unusually subdued. I knew her well enough to see the panic brewing beneath the surface. She wasn't thinking about reconciliation anymore. She was thinking about damage control. But I was already 2 steps ahead. By the time she was settling into her office, I had already sent the first wave of truths crashing down. First, I called her parents. "Hi, Linda," I said when her mother answered, her voice warm as ever. "It's Greg. I need to talk to you and Robert about something serious." "What is it, dear? You sound upset," she replied, her tone shifting to concern. "It's about Claire," I said, my voice steady but laced with bitterness. "She's been unfaithful." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "She's having an affair," I continued, sparing no details. "It's been going on for months. I have proof, texts, photos, everything." Linda was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Oh my God!" Her father took the phone, his voice booming with anger. "Is this true, Greg? You're sure?" "I wouldn't make this call if I wasn't," I replied. "I thought you both deserved to know." Robert muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch, but his fury was palpable. "Thank you for telling us," he said finally. "We'll handle it from here." Next, I reached out to her close friend Jenny, the same woman she had used as an alibi during her fake yoga sessions. When I told her the truth, Jenny's disbelief quickly turned to outrage. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling. "She's been lying to me, too?" "She has," I confirmed. "I'm not asking you to pick sides, Jenny. I just think you deserve to know who she really is." By midday, the ripples were spreading further. I sent an anonymous email to her office's HR department, attaching a selection of the photos I'd found. Nothing too explicit, just enough to make it clear that Claire had been engaging in inappropriate behavior with someone who worked at a business connected to their firm. It wasn't vindictive, I told myself. It was justice. By the afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages. Linda texted me. She called me crying. "I don't even know what to say to her right now. I'm so disappointed in her, Greg." Jenny called to tell me that Claire had tried to downplay the affair, calling it a lapse in judgment. And then, there was the email from Tyrone. "Hey, Greg," it began, dripping with condescension. "I heard you've been busy spreading rumors about Claire and me. For the record, whatever you think, you don't. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with controlling her, she wouldn't have looked elsewhere. Just saying." I clenched my jaw, rereading his smug words. He was poking the bear, trying to provoke me, but he didn't understand that I wasn't the same man I'd been a week ago. I didn't respond. Instead, I added his name to my growing list of things to handle. That evening, Claire came home looking more frazzled than I'd ever seen her. Her usual polished composure was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of desperation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice breaking as she set her purse down. I sat in the living room, arms crossed. "Go ahead. Why are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes filling with tears. "Why are you telling everyone?" "Because they deserve to know," I said simply. "Your parents, your friends, your coworkers. None of them deserve to be lied to." "But you're ruining my life," she cried, her voice rising. "Don't you see that?" "You ruined it yourself, Claire," I said coldly. "I'm just making sure the truth catches up with you." She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I can't do this, Greg. I can't." "Then don't," I said, standing and heading for the door. But this is far from over. As I left the room, I heard her sobs echo behind me. For a brief moment, a flicker of guilt tugged at the edges of my mind. But it passed quickly. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. The fallout from my actions hit Claire. By Monday morning, her carefully constructed image was crumbling. Her parents, once her staunchest allies, were no longer taking her calls. Her friends, those who hadn't already confronted her, were sending curt, evasive messages. At work, she walked into a storm. The HR email had made its way to her supervisor, and though the photos weren't explicit, the implications were damning enough. I heard through mutual friends that she'd been placed on leave pending an investigation. She came home that evening a shell of herself. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slumped, and she looked like she hadn't eaten all day. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You did this to me," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. "No," I replied, not looking up from my laptop. "You did this to yourself." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Exposing me like this? All you've done is destroy everything we built together." "What we built?" I stood, the words spilling out of me like molten lava. "You destroyed that when you decided to cheat. When you lied to me, Claire. When you made our life a game you played behind my back." Her lip quivered, but her defiance remained. "You're not perfect, Greg. You think you're better than me because you've been a loyal little husband? You were always so distant, so focused on work. I needed something you couldn't give me. That's your excuse?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You cheated because I was too busy trying to give us a future? You threw away everything for some fling with a waiter." "It wasn't a fling," she hissed, stepping closer. It was different." I laughed, cold and bitter. "You're a liar. And now everyone knows it." The room fell silent, the weight of our words hanging thick in the air. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms, my tone flat. "Good. Pack whatever you need. Just don't forget to take the lies with you." She stared at me for a moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she turned and disappeared into the bedroom. As I sat back down, I heard her sobbing through the walls, but I didn't go to her. My sympathy had run dry. By the time she left the next morning, suitcase in hand, the house felt both emptier and strangely lighter. Claire's departure should have felt like closure, but instead, it left a bitter void. I spent the next few days vacillating between anger and a hollow numbness. The house was quieter now, almost unnervingly so. Her presence had always been like a storm, but the aftermath was no less chaotic. I decided to focus my energy on the next step, pulling apart the tangled web of her lies. I started with Tyrone. His email had been cocky, a blatant provocation. But cockiness comes from a place of confidence, and I was determined to break his. I contacted the restaurant where he worked, posing as someone interested in hiring him for a private catering event. The manager, an older man with a thick New York accent, was eager to chat about his star employee. "He's a natural with people," the manager said proudly. "Customers love him. Never seen a guy get so many tips. I'll bet," I muttered under my breath before asking, "Does he take time off often?" "He seems pretty busy outside of work." The manager hesitated. "Well, yeah. He's taken a few last-minute days recently. But he's always got some excuse, family emergency, car trouble, you name it." "Why? Is this about his side gig?" "Side gig?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "Yeah, he does private bartending and event setups on the side," the manager said casually. "Good hustle. But I've told him not to let it interfere with his shifts." I thanked him and ended the call, my mind racing. Tyrone's so-called side gigs aligned too neatly with the times Claire's purse tracker had placed her at hotels or odd locations. That evening, I went through the photos and messages again, this time paying closer attention to the backgrounds. A recurring detail caught my eye. A silver bracelet Tyrone wore in every photo, one that seemed far too expensive for a waiter's salary. It was a lead, however small. I reached out to Dan again, asking him to dig into Tyrone's finances. "You really want me to do this?" Dan asked, his voice hesitant. "This is starting to feel less like justice and more like obsession, Greg." "It's not obsession," I replied, though even I wasn't sure if that was true. "I need to know who I'm dealing with. Just do this for me." The next day, Dan called back. "Got something interesting," he said. "Your guy Tyrone has an offshore account. It's not massive, but it's definitely unusual for someone in his line of work." "What's in it?" I asked. "A few big deposits over the last year," Dan explained. "The names are redacted, but the transfers came from an investment account. You mentioned Claire manages her own portfolio, right? Claire's inheritance. Can you prove it's her account? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. Not yet, Dan admitted. But if you can get me access to her financials, I might be able to connect the dots. It was all falling into place. Tyrone wasn't just a fling. He was a carefully orchestrated scheme. Claire had funded him, supported him, and perhaps even planned a future with him. The realization hit me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was premeditated. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, staring at the folders of evidence, the tracker app, and the financial breadcrumbs. Each piece felt like a part of a puzzle that I hadn't yet completed. But I wasn't done. If Claire and Tyrone thought they could outsmart me, they were about to learn how wrong they were. By now, the full weight of Claire's betrayal had crystallized into something sharper. Resolve. She wasn't just a cheating spouse. She was a manipulator, a liar, and a thief. And Tyrone? He was her accomplice, brazen enough to flaunt his smugness in my face. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle every false structure they'd built, piece by piece. The first step was gaining access to Claire's financials. I knew her better than she realized. Her passwords hadn't changed in years, and her favorite hiding spots were as predictable as her excuses. That evening, I found her old tablet in the bottom drawer of her bedside table. She'd stopped using it months ago, which meant she wouldn't notice if I logged in. Sure enough, her password still worked. I scoured her investment account, scrolling through months of transactions. There it was, $20,000 transferred over 6 months, disguised as consultation fees to a shell company. The company's name, I discovered after some digging, was linked to none other than Tyrone. My jaw tightened as I pieced it together. Claire wasn't just supporting him emotionally. She was bankrolling him. The next morning, I called Dan. I've got the connection, I said. Her account. His shell company. It's all there. Dan let out a low whistle. You're holding a grenade, Greg. What's the plan? I'm going to pull the pin, I replied. The trap needed to be perfect, public, irrefutable, and devastating. I decided to use Claire's own world against her. She was scheduled to attend a small marketing gala that weekend, one she'd been hyping up for weeks. It was the perfect stage. I reached out to Jenny, her once loyal friend, and explained everything. Jenny was still furious with Claire for lying to her, and it didn't take much to convince her to help. The plan was simple. Jenny would invite Tyrone to the event under the guise of needing a bartender. Meanwhile, I'd plant the evidence. Screenshots of the transactions, their texts, and photos. Jenny would circulate it discreetly among Claire's colleagues during the gala. It was bold. It was cruel. And it was exactly what they deserved. Saturday arrived, and the gala buzzed with energy as guests mingled in the glittering ballroom. I stayed out of sight, watching from a quiet corner as the trap unfolded. Jenny worked quickly, handing off printed copies of the evidence to a few key figures, ensuring it would spread like wildfire. Then, as if on cue, Tyrone arrived, dressed sharply but clearly out of place among the suits and gowns. He scanned the room, his confidence unwavering, until his eyes landed on Claire. She froze, her expression a mix of panic and disbelief. "Claire," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "You didn't tell me I'd see you here." The room went silent, every pair of eyes locking onto them. Claire stammered, her usual composure shattering under the weight of the growing whispers. And then the evidence hit. One by one, her colleagues pulled out their phones, scanning the damning screenshots. Murmurs turned into gasps, and someone even dropped their champagne glass, the sound ringing like a death knell. Claire's face went pale as she realized what was happening. She turned to me, because of course she knew I was behind it, and for a moment, there was nothing but raw hatred in her eyes. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Me," I replied evenly. Tyrone looked between us, confused and suddenly less confident. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice faltering. "You're about to find out," I said, my voice cold. The room erupted in chaos as Claire's carefully constructed world came crashing down. The chaos in the ballroom was electric. Guests exchanged shocked whispers, their gazes flicking between Claire, Tyrone, and the incriminating evidence now circulating like wildfire. Claire's co-workers, many of whom had admired her poise and professionalism, looked at her like a stranger. Her boss, a stern woman named Margaret, was holding one of the damning printouts. She approached Claire with a mixture of fury and disgust. "Claire," Margaret said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the din, "is this true?" Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face was pale, her eyes darting to Tyrone as if he could somehow save her. Margaret pressed on. "You've embarrassed this company, jeopardized your position, and stained your reputation. We'll talk first thing Monday morning." With that, she turned and walked away, the printout still clenched in her hand. Claire's mask finally cracked. She turned to me, her expression wild. "How could you do this, Greg?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You've ruined everything. Everything." I shot back, my voice cold and steady. "You mean the lies? The deceit? Your little affair with him?" I pointed at Tyrone, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I never meant for it to get this far," Claire pleaded, her tone shifting to desperation. "I was going to end it, I swear. You didn't have to do this." "Didn't I?" I asked, stepping closer. "You humiliated me, Claire. You betrayed me, and you thought you could keep getting away with it." Tyrone, finally snapping out of his daze, tried to insert himself into the conversation. "Look, man, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this isn't." "Shut up," I snapped, turning to face him. "You're nothing, just a leech who latched onto her for money. But guess what? The well's dry." His bravado crumbled, and he shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the gawking crowd. Claire's voice rose, panicked. "You're not innocent in this, Greg. You've been distant, cold. This isn't all my fault. Maybe I wasn't perfect," I admitted, my voice sharp. "But I didn't betray you. I didn't lie. You had a choice, Claire, and you chose this." Tears streamed down her face, her carefully crafted image now in complete ruins. "Please, Greg, don't do this. We can fix it." I laughed bitterly. "Fix it? Claire, it's broken beyond repair. And the world knows now. There's no hiding from this." The tension in the room was suffocating. Claire stood frozen, Tyrone inching toward the door like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. "Good luck," I said, my voice dripping with finality. "You're going to need it." With that, I walked out of the ballroom, leaving Claire and Tyrone behind to face the consequences of their actions. As I stepped into the cool night air, the weight I'd been carrying for months finally began to lift. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. The next morning, the world had shifted for both of us. Claire's disgrace spread faster than I anticipated. Word of the gala fiasco reached her extended network by midday. Her social media accounts, once filled with glowing comments and likes, were eerily silent. She didn't return home that night, which suited me just fine. By Monday, her professional life was in ruins. Margaret followed through on her promise, calling Claire into the office and terminating her employment on the spot. I heard through Jenny that Margaret didn't hold back, citing gross misconduct and irreparable damage to the company's reputation in front of the whole team. Tyrone didn't fare much better. His restaurant manager fired him after learning about his involvement, thanks to another anonymous tip. I wasn't done teaching him the cost of arrogance. As for Claire, her parents had called me late Sunday night. "We had no idea," Linda said, her voice heavy with sadness. "She told us things were fine, that you were happy. She lied to you just like she lied to me?" I replied, bitterness creeping into my tone. Robert sighed. "Greg, we don't condone what she's done, but she's still our daughter. We'll help her if we can, but we're deeply disappointed." I thanked them for their support and hung up, knowing their help wouldn't be enough to shield Claire from what was coming next. On Tuesday, I received an email from my lawyer. The divorce papers were ready, and I wasted no time delivering them. I handed them to Claire myself, meeting her in the sterile hallway of the hotel where she'd been staying. She looked worn, her usual elegance replaced by shadows under her eyes and a strained expression. When I handed her the envelope, she barely glanced at it before whispering, "Greg, don't do this. It's already done," I said flatly. Tears welled up, but I didn't care anymore. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "You've taken enough from me, Claire. I'll see you in court." As I turned and walked away, I felt the faintest pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. After I handed Claire the divorce papers, I thought the hardest part was behind me. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The truth had to be laid bare, and everyone involved needed to face the full weight of their choices. A week later, I sat across from my lawyer, Jim, a no-nonsense type with a knack for strategy. "You've got a strong case," he said, flipping through the file I'd built. "The infidelity, the financial misconduct, it's all here. We can leverage this for the divorce settlement." "I don't just want leverage," I replied, my tone firm. "I want accountability." She used my trust, my resources, and dragged my name through the mud. "I want it all on record." Jim nodded, his expression serious. "We'll make sure it is. And the financials? That'll sting. The money she funneled to Tyrone through her inheritance. It's marital property. You're entitled to half." That was my next step. Ensuring Claire's betrayal cost her more than just her reputation. The hearing came quickly, and Claire showed up looking pale and exhausted. Tyrone wasn't there, but his presence was felt in every piece of evidence submitted. I watched her squirm as my lawyer laid everything out. Her texts, the financial records, even the shell company she'd used to hide her payments to him. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, granting me the lion's share of our joint assets, Claire's shoulders slumped. Her lawyer whispered something, but she barely reacted. It was over for her in the legal sense, but I had one last move to make. That evening, I sent an email to a reporter from a local business column, a small, respectable publication that often covered scandals and corporate misconduct. I kept it clean, factual, and included the evidence. I knew the story would hit hard. A rising star in the marketing world undone by her affair and misuse of funds. The article went live 2 days later. It wasn't front-page news, but it circulated enough to ensure Claire's fall from grace was complete. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house that used to feel like home, I realized I didn't feel triumph. I felt empty. The revenge I had sought so desperately had brought closure, but it hadn't healed the scars she left behind. In the weeks following the court hearing, the dust began to settle. Claire's world had shattered completely, and I no longer heard from her. The house was mine now, legally and symbolically, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like standing in the wreckage of a life I once thought was unbreakable. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Linda, Claire's mother. "Greg," she said softly, "Claire's in the hospital. Stress-induced complications." I froze, unsure how to respond. "Is she okay?" "She will be," Linda said, her voice trembling. "She's not the same, Greg. This has all taken a toll on her. She blames herself, of course, but I wanted to ask, would you come see her? Maybe it would help." For a moment I considered it. I imagined standing by her hospital bed, staring at the woman I had once loved. But the weight of her betrayal was still too fresh, the wounds too raw. "I'm sorry, Linda," I said finally. "I can't. Not now." She didn't argue, and we ended the call quietly. That evening, I sat on the porch, staring out at the fading sunset. For months, my life had been consumed by rage, revenge, and a need for justice. I'd succeeded in exposing Claire, tearing apart the facade she'd built, but I realized something crucial. I was still carrying the weight of what she'd done. Revenge had been my focus, but it hadn't brought peace. The next morning, I started making changes. I packed up the reminders of our life together. Photos, mementos, and the wedding album I hadn't been able to look at since the affair came to light. I donated what I could and stored the rest in the attic, out of sight and out of mind. I threw myself into work, reconnecting with friends, and rebuilding the parts of myself I'd neglected during the storm of our marriage. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger threatened to creep back, when the betrayal felt fresh again. But slowly, the pieces of my life began to fall into place. One evening, months later, I stood on that same porch, watching another sunset. The house no longer felt like a graveyard of what could have been. It felt like mine. Claire's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying. It taught me the importance of boundaries, trust, and knowing when to let go.